Senator Carr.
Mr Acting Deputy President, now, anyone familiar with the university sector knows that research funding is an increasingly contested matter. And I'm not referring to the total amount of Commonwealth funding provided through the Australian Research Council, although that is a continuing issue. Last month, the Education Minister squeezed the funding a little further by sequestering $12 million for a special research initiative. And I'll have more to say about that issue in the committee stages of the bill. Today I want to talk about the importance of international collaboration for Australian universities. And I've argued this before. Such collaboration is essential if Australian scientists are to punch above their weight. Australia has neither the scale of physical or human capital, nor the sufficiently large domestic market to engage the international frontiers of technology by itself. This country spends about $25 billion a year on R&D, compared with about $500 billion each year by the United States and China. Slightly more than half of our R&D spend is by business, but that's mostly on applications of existing knowledge. Universities are the main institutions in Australia for engaging in the discovery of new knowledge, and measured by articles cited in peer-reviewed journals, collaboration with China and a range of other countries is increasingly important. In some areas, it's actually vital. In materials science, in energy and engineering, and in computer science. Collaboration with Chinese researchers has also led to life-saving breakthroughs in medical science. Possibly, most famously, is the development of Gardasil. The vaccine was produced by Professor Ian Fraser and Dr Zhang Zhu. Now, I assume that no one wishes that that work had never been undertaken. But increasingly there are people who do want to obstruct research collaboration with China. In parts of the defence and security establishment, there are hawks intent on fighting a new Cold War. They have waged a muttering campaign against collaborations with China, and it's found eager acolytes in sections of the Australian media. The result has been a spate of stories thick with assertions that vilify and denigrate Australian researchers and their work. Doubt is cast on their loyalty to Australia. Stories, however, offer no evidence that any of these researchers have actually acted as cat's paws of a foreign power. Now, just yesterday, for example, on the front page of The Australian, under the lurid headline, Security Risk in Australia and China Maritime Project, the doubts were raised about a 5-year, $20 million partnership between the CSIRO and China's Qingdao National Laboratory for Marine Science and Technology. Those allegations were repeated again today. This is a joint project, the Centre for Southern Hemisphere Oceans and Research, conducting research into ocean temperatures and currents and their role in climate change. The centre is headed by the highly regarded CSIRO researcher Professor Kuo Wen-ju. The Australian report, however, that hints that there is something sinister in the research collaboration because Qingdao University also conducts research into the development of satellite-based lasers to locate submarines. Now, the report does not cite any notifications of any breach of security by CSIRO or any notification of investigation of a possible breach. And to my knowledge, none has occurred. Now, CSIRO responded to this report with Larry Marshall, the CEO of CSIRO, writing to The Australian. Now, that report, that letter to the editor, was edited very heavily to a form that one might say doctored. And so I'll repeat the report, the letter that was actually presented to The Australian, not the one that actually appeared in the paper today. And I quote, "To imply the centre posing a national security risk without any supportive claims of fact is alarmist and irresponsible reporting. With all the centre's research outcomes available in the public domain, calls for greater transparency about this research are disingenuous." Now, let me be not misunderstood in any way. I'm not suggesting that universities or public research agencies need have any or no concern for their research that affects national security. But we should act with regard to evidence and proven fact, not ideological-driven assertions. This country already has stricter regimes in research collaboration than the United States. And I am not aware of any reports of scientific fraud as has occurred in the United States. The Defence Trade Controls Act 2012 was introduced under the former Labor government and was in response to concerns that it was too easy for other nations and perhaps non-state actors to obtain sensitive materials from this country. The Act regulates access to technologies placed on the Defence Strategic Goods List, which are reviewed annually. And the Defence Department is in regular contact with universities and industry to ensure their compliance. And since the Act was introduced, there have been no reported breach by an Australian university. The operations of the Act has been independently reviewed by Dr Vivienne Toms, a former Director General of Intelligence and Security. And in her report of October 2018, she rejected calls for tougher restrictions on the technology transfer. In November last year, the Education Minister announced new guidelines agreed to by the universities for vetting international research collaboration. Media reports with headlines such as "Rooting out campus spies" announced the new vigilance measures. Universities will have to work more closely with security agencies, upgrade their cybersecurity, identify staff, I quote, who have international financial interests or affiliations with foreign institutions. Now, I ask, are these the staff, that campus spies, that are supposed to be rooted out? The media reports don't say. Of course, they do cite alleged instances of dangerous collaborations. And the most frequently mentioned has involved facial recognition technology involving the Chinese surveillance of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. According to the reports in the Australian, an artificial intelligence company formed by the University of Queensland professor is alleged to have used this surveillance. Now, in the Australian report, the weasel word "alleged" is used. And I repeat, because there have been no reported breaches of the Defence Control Act by any Australian or science agency, I find it strange that the Australian report is not able to provide any context and to understand the manner in which this research is undertaken. The country, of course, this country is important to state, has no homegrown tech giants such as Google. Here, university research is essential in creating artificial intelligence knowledge. AI knowledge is the key to technologies for the fourth industrial revolution, which is transforming the world's workplaces. Australia, of course, as the leading collaborator, is with China by far. The implications of ending this collaboration should be clear. In another report, in the Australian University of New South Wales Computer Science is said to have co-authored research with Chinese generals linked to Beijing's nuclear weapons program. Now, if that was true, it would be a clear breach of the Australian Defence Export Control Act. No reports have occurred. Now, of course, why is this happening? Well, because the global geopolitical environment has shifted substantially in the last 5 years. And much of this is focused on fears, particularly in the United States, about cyber warfare and industrial espionage. The Trump administration has been seeking stricter restrictions on science and technology exchanges with the Chinese. And there have been very willing advocates here in Australia for such a position. One of those, of course, is ASPI. ASPI is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. ASPI has launched the China Defence Universities Tracker, a website dealing with the defence and security links of more than 160 Chinese universities and research agencies. Now, just what the tracker will do that is not already being done by the Defence Department and the Australian universities, of course, is under the Defence Trade Control, is not clear to me. But what is clear is that the source of the funding. Now, ASPI acknowledges that it's the United States Defence Department, the United States State Department, this Global Engagement Centre. The Global Engagement Centre coordinator is one Ms Lee Gabriel. She's described on the website as, in that United States website, as a former US Navy fighter pilot who later trained with the CIA and was assigned to the Defence Intelligence Agency. So while ASPI has not found any Chinese spooks yet, at least one spook is in plain sight. ASPI is registered under the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, and it disclosed that it is receiving State Department funding under the requirements of the scheme. But no details are provided. And of course, there's nothing in their annual report for 2018-19. It merely says, and I quote, income of $448,000 has been received in advance of sponsorship of ASPI's program for the financial year 2019-20. So the US government's funding of this tracker report of nearly $450,000 has been withheld from the readers of this report. So much for full disclosure and transparency. Now just imagine if other organisations tried to make their public records so vague. If it's fair to scrutinise and to challenge the funding arrangements of researchers in Australian universities and science agency, surely it's fair to subject ASPI funding arrangements to the same level of scrutiny. ASPI receives core funding of $4 million from the Department of Defence, but it takes more than double that amount in commissioned and sponsored income and earnings from other events. The money from the Global Engagement Centre provides ASPI's China Defence University Tracker is an example of that supplementary funding. ASPI has other sponsors. The French aerospace and defence manufacturer Thales, for example, which have long involvement in this country. I might note, this is a company that I have had long-standing engagement with as well. A very fine company operating in this country. Thales is also an investor in China, including in the development of its air traffic control management system for Beijing International Airport. Mr Jerome Bendel, Thales' group's Vice President for North Asia, says that the group is, and I quote, committed and a key partner in China's journey to become a more digitalised and innovative country. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But it is puzzling that ASPI hasn't made much more of it, given the way they treat our science agencies and our universities. Because they berate the Australian researchers for collaborating with Chinese partners, but they ignore the fact that some of their own sponsors do the same. A simple proposition. We have seen a report in today's Australia, and I'll say more about this in a moment, of the ARC providing grants of over $250 million over the last 5 years to collaborators, Australian researchers and Chinese collaborators. Nothing was done improperly about that. Totally inconsistent with government policy. But according to this, the selective use of these so-called collaborations, we now have to become all too common. And just because it's selective doesn't make it right. It's something we should make it clear. If you're going to play this level of scrutiny, then ASPI is entitled to be scrutinised in exactly the same way.